Hello, everyone. We're back with another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. This time we're discussing issue 7-1, Warriors of the Nile, Conflict in Ancient Egypt. With me today are Lindsay Powell, Murray Dahm, Joshua Brouwers, and Ariana Sacco. Welcome, everyone. In this issue we have Ancient Egypt, a huge big topic, which was discussed in quite a few, sometimes shorter articles about the sources, something about the interaction between Egypt and the Hyksos, fortifications, weaponry, the diplomacy between the various kings in the ancient Near East and Egypt, and of course a battle, this time the Battle of Kadesh. For the topic, as always, we go to a short introduction by Michael Taylor.
Egypt was one of the earliest and most splendid civilizations to flourish in the ancient Mediterranean. The rise of Egypt owed almost entirely to geography. First, the Nile, with its annual silt-depositing floods, produced incredible agricultural fertility, with yields that were 15 to 20 times as bountiful as crop yields elsewhere in the Mediterranean. This fertility, however, was highly concentrated, within a few miles of the river itself, making Egypt a tax collector's dream. Administrators could easily use the river as a highway to access dense populations and extract their ample agricultural surplus. The geography that allowed state power to flourish at an early period also limited military expansion. Past the fertile strip of the Nile, there is little but desert. Conquest was therefore limited to three basic directions: up the Nile River itself into Nubia, westwards along the narrow strip of coastal Libya, and northerly through the Gaza Strip into what is today Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Of course, this geographic determinism worked the other way. The Gaza corridor is also an invasion route, which over time would be used by the Assyrians and the Persians. Invaders could also sail up the Nile from the sea, as did the mysterious Sea Peoples at the end of the New Kingdom. Warfare was central to the ideology of the pharaohs. In Egyptian myth, the god Horus, a figure closely identified with the reigning pharaoh, is responsible for hunting down and defeating the god Seth, who is a force of chaos and disorder in the universe. Just as Horus subdues and then castrates Seth, so the pharaoh was expected to subdue and triumph over his enemies. Before we begin, a few notes on chronology. Egyptologists divide up the political history of Egypt into three basic periods: the Old Kingdom, which in Egyptian chronologies dates from 2686 to 2181, and the Old Kingdom produced the great monuments such as the pyramids and the Sphinx. After an intermediate period of political disorder came the Middle Kingdom from 2134 to 1660, and after yet another intermediate period, the New Kingdom from 1550 to 1069. The New Kingdom, particularly under the warrior pharaoh Ramses II, saw the maximum extent of the Egyptian empire. In a great northern campaign, Ramses II invaded Syria and fought the Hittite king at the Battle of Kadesh in 1289. The New Kingdom survived the forces that destroyed both the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace system, but severe internal problems caused a steep decline in Egyptian power. In the 7th century, the Assyrians, the new dominant force of the Iron Age, invaded Egypt. While the land would from time to time reassert its political independence, the rich lands of the Nile were ruled by a succession of foreign conquerors: the Assyrians, the Persians, the Macedonians, and finally the Romans.
Right. Michael, who's not taking part today, but is very much thanked for his contribution. This is clearly expressed that this is really a big topic. As we said in the preparation, out of the 3,500 years that could possibly be part of the topics for ancient warfare, Egypt is around for all of those years, and most of it as its own kingdom. And I remember that when Yosho put this issue together, that was quite a feat. You want to tell us something about that, Yosho?
This is a very broad topic and also fairly esoteric, I think. for most of the ancient warfare writers, readers also. And the result was that I didn't get an awful lot of proposals, and the proposals that I did get sort of ran the gamut chronologically from Middle Kingdom, Egypt, which is say 2000 to 1650 BC, all the way down to nearly the Ptolemaic era, or the Ptolemaic era even. So the problem was in trying to narrow the scope down of the issue to make it more or less a single whole. So in the end, we decided to go with the bulk of the articles, which covered the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom, which is basically from about 2000 to say 1100 BC. The exact dates are in the issue. So 2 articles got scrapped in that regard. They will be undoubtedly published at a later date. One of them was about the Battle of Pelusium, for example, which I would really like to see published. And the rest is what ended up in the issue. Originally, I had somebody else planned to write the introduction, and 2 other authors were going to contribute a 2 or 3 page short article about leather from the chariots, from one of the chariots of the tomb of Tutankhamun. But unfortunately, those fell through, as it sometimes happens, and I was more or less obliged to step in and write the introduction and a short 2-page article on diplomacy in the Late Bronze Age, which is also a very interesting subject. And that's how the article, how the issue came to be. The main article, the feature article, the battle, couldn't be anything else but the Battle of Kadesh, I think, and that was done by Bridget McDermott.
Yeah, it's quite a feat putting together such a long history in a selection of 7-8 articles. But you said yourself that it's actually for Egypt perhaps doable because the culture of the country doesn't change that much, and the broad strokes of strategy and policy can be easily indicated.
Yeah, more or less. It's Egyptian culture is always sort of painted as very conservative, which is true to a certain extent. There are, of course, loads of changes and stylistic developments and that sort of stuff. But on the whole, you can sort of paint a very broad image of Egypt and not be too far away from the truth, I think, and I will be undoubtedly corrected by the Egyptologist sitting next to me if I say something that is untrue. But basically, you have Egypt, which occupies a unique place basically in the history of the ancient world. You have this country that is more or less isolated from the outside. It has deserts to the east and to the west. It has the river Nile, which runs through it, which is a lifeline that overflows regularly every year to inundate the land and make it deposit fertile soil, as Michael also said in his introduction. That also provides the main line of communications for the country. There is the Mediterranean Sea towards the north, where the Egyptians generally didn't really venture into. And then in the south you have the Nubians, basically, beyond Aswan. And so you have this very compact country focused on the river, isolated, that sort of develops largely on its own, with some interaction with the nearby Near East and with Nubia and Sudan, etc. But a very unique country that is also very proud of its own history and its own culture, and sort of tries to maintain that. Also, it's what you see, for example, when Alexander the Great appears and the successor Ptolemy takes over. They all adapt themselves to the Egyptian mindset, basically. The Ptolemaic kings are depicted as Egyptian pharaohs of old, and that gives it a certain homogeneity, if you can say so, that is not often found anywhere else in the ancient world, especially not for so long a period. Nevertheless, there are clearly developments, especially also when you look at the military side of things. If you look at the early history from about the unification of the country, supposedly under Narmer and other early dynastic kings, down Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, you have a country where militarily it's very focused internally on defense, on trying to keep people out. There were migrants, of course, but it was very focused on defense. There were loads of border fortifications that were constructed also. It was unified at an early stage. One of the interesting things, archaeologically speaking, about a territorial state compared to something like a city-state, for example, is that fortifications and other military defenses are usually concentrated not around individual cities, but more along the borders and other vulnerable areas. So you have a very almost isolationist country, say, during the older Middle Kingdoms, and with the second intermediate period at the end of the Middle Kingdom, 1650, 1550 more or less, you suddenly have this dynasty of foreigners that rules Egypt, or especially the Delta, for a while, called the Hyksos. And where exactly they came from, Ariana will be able to tell you everything, but probably they arose from the local Asiatic populations that were living there. They were some sort of dominant caste. And that was the first time actually that Egypt had been dominated by outsiders, and that probably created a kind of uneasiness with the Egyptians. They sort of realized probably that they couldn't just stay away from the rest of the world. They had to interact somehow, and then you see changes in the military sphere in the New Kingdom, where they become much more cosmopolitan, if you will, where Egyptians also start venturing into Levantine areas. They intensify their contacts with the Near East. There is much more interaction with other kingdoms of the ancient Near East in the late Bronze Age. Some people were able to speak about a kind of cuneiform culture for the late Bronze Age, where you have these big kingdoms, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mitanni, later the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all interacting with each other, all the kings thereof, all the great kings, sending letters to each other, referring to themselves as brothers. It really becomes very international almost, and you have these clashes also between these big kingdoms, of course. You have the Hittites and the Egyptians interact with each other. The Hittites send princesses to the Egyptian court for the Egyptian kings to marry, etc. They do letter exchanges. They send gifts. King of Babylon that sends golden statues to Egypt, for example, for a visit. All that sort of stuff, where you see this really dense interaction that also translates to military conflict at times, of course, and that's very aptly demonstrated, for example, by the Battle of Megiddo, which was discussed in an earlier issue of Ancient Warfare, where Thutmose III fought against an alliance of Canaanite rebels. And of course, in this issue, the Battle of Kadesh, where you have the big confrontation between the Egyptian army under Ramesses II versus the Hittites.
The significance of the Battle of Kadesh is what exactly, Joshua? Because from what I recall, the outcome is claimed as victory basically on both sides.
Basically, the Battle of Kadesh, it's Ramesses II was very active in the Levant, trying to maintain Egyptian dominance in the Levant. They had lots of vassal kings there, and at one point the king of the Hittite Empire, Muwatalli II, mounted an expedition to free Amuru from Egyptian influence, and Amuru is located in Syria, a little to the north of Kadesh. So he set out a big campaign, a big army. They went south, and Ramesses, of course, moved north, and eventually they managed to run into each other at Kadesh. The whole battle is a little disorganized. Also, if you read Richard McDermott's account, it's nearly a chance encounter. There's different divisions move, and they sort of surprise each other, and they move around each other. They cross rivers, and etc. And the outcome of the battle, if you look at the descriptions that Ramesses II left behind, it seems that the Egyptians clearly won a major victory and defeated the Hittites. Whereas if you read the Hittite accounts, it seems that the Hittites won a major victory, and so it's not exactly clear what happened precisely, what the outcome was, who won, or if there even was a single winner. What we do know is that eventually a peace was negotiated between the two. Not between Muwatalli, he was already gone, and he was replaced. It's a little complicated, but he eventually was replaced by his brother Hattusili III, who negotiated a peace with Ramesses II. And at that point, what you see is basically a kind of status quo. The Hittites are still there in the region, and the Egyptians are also there in the region, and there is this uneasy peace. And the Hittites probably at that point wanted a peace with Egypt very desperately, because Assyria at the meantime had risen up, had liberated itself from the Mitanni, which had slowly crumbled. And the Hittites probably weren't looking forward to fighting a war on two different fronts, fighting the Egyptians in the south and fighting the Assyrians a little further to the south east. So they probably needed to make a peace, and then they decided to make a peace with the Egyptians, probably because they were further away and didn't pose as much of a threat as the Assyrians, that were much closer.
Well, could you argue that the Egyptians then possibly more likely lost the battle, since they also went for peace, when, if they'd been aware of those political situations, might have pressed further forward?
But it's very difficult to say that precisely, because it wasn't a crushing defeat for the Hittites, at least. It wasn't a major decisive victory for the Egyptians. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed to negotiate a peace. They would have just said, "Oh, we're going to take this, and we're going to take Amuru and everything else, and forget it." They wouldn't have needed to negotiate anything. But maybe Ariana wants to add something about it also.
Actually, the forces of Egyptians and Hittites were equal, so nobody was able to overcome on the others. And so they found more convenient to have a peace. Just the problem was how to present this in the homeland, in Egypt. I mean, the king was the one that had to show that it was invincible. So it was the one that has to reestablish the order, the mat over the chaos. So it couldn't go home in Egypt and say, "I'm sorry, I didn't manage to do anything." So he had to show that he had accomplished something, that is, the order was established again.
It's an age-old problem, isn't it, that a leader takes his country to war, or maybe encounters an enemy and tries to defeat them and doesn't quite pull it off. How is he going to present that to his home audience? It's an age-old problem.
Is that perhaps too why the king seems to emphasize his own role in battle, or is that normal for Egypt?
Well, this is something that is more emphasized in the New Kingdom, because the kings, the same Ramesside, so the same Ramesses II, his father, Seti I, they are from a family of military men from the Delta. Let's say, very much nearby, almost from Avaris. So it's also the previous capital of Ixos. And the fact that they are military men also contributes to make them emphasize this aspect of their regality. Because going to establish the order of the chaos, to defeat the enemies, was something always embedded with the Egyptian regality, but it was even more in the New Kingdom. Also because in the army acquires more importance in the New Kingdom after what happens with the reconquest, let's say, of Kamose and his brother Amose, that managed to send the Ixos away from Lower Egypt. And also in this case, their this reconquest is presented as a planned war, so it's something unitary, but actually we're just more likely a sort of raid, because also if you read the account, they go city by city northwards up to reaching Avaris, but it's not something really planned in advance, as can be the campaigns, for example, in the later New Kingdom.
Can I ask what kind of army the Egyptian army was? Was it a professional army, or was it a conscript army? Was it a mercenary army?
That was more in the New Kingdom. Actually, there were more conscript until the New Kingdom.
So they would be compelled to fight for maybe one campaign season?
Also, yes. Yes, and then go back to harvest, to the agriculture.
It's in the older Middle Kingdoms. Every nome, which is the regional divisions in Egypt, the governors there raised conscripts basically whenever there was a war. So it was if there was a war to be fought or a battle to be fought, the pharaoh would send out, or the king would send out messages to governors in nomes, and then the governors would be responsible for raising an army in the separate districts.
So it's very much like medieval Europe in effect then. I mean, the king calls on his dukes and the earls go back to their the subdivisions and call forward the army.
You see that relatively frequently in the especially in the Bronze Age. It's also been suggested, for example, for the Mycenaean military organization, that it's a mixture of public and private means, that you have a professional warrior group, say, and then you have that they are responsible also for raising further conscripts. It's also sort of similar like what you also see in medieval Japan, for example.
So the implication of that is then you're going to see a wide variety of arms and equipment. And what's fascinating to me is that, of course, you've got people using bronze swords, those wonderful curved swords, which I like so much. But at the same time, they're also using stones. I mean, these are stones on sticks, maces. Maybe
it's the innate conservatism. I don't know, but it's despite the introduction of bronze, it doesn't immediately mean that everything is translated to bronze, especially not in Egypt, where stone still remains a feature, and you have flint arrowheads used all the way to the New Kingdom, I think, as far as I know. So yeah, it's stone remains in use. I mean, a stone-tipped arrowhead will kill you just as well as a bronze-tipped.
So a khopesh would really be quite a rare sight on the battlefield, is the implication of that?
Yeah, it sort of depends, because again, it's a mixture of public and private means. So the governors and the other people that had to raise the conscripts usually were also expected to provide them with most of the weapons, at least. There is probably more like where they would have had weapon stores or armories from which they could have supplied their people. It's probably similar like what you saw, like for example in the Mycenaean world, where we have the Linear B records, where the palace supplies certain Hecatai, which are the noblemen basically, with bits and pieces of chariots. So they give them one horse and a wheel, and then sort of the implication is they already have a chariot and one wheel and one horse, but they still need a horse and a wheel, and then the palace gives them that in exchange for their service. And it's more or less probably the same in Egypt at one point, where you have these different layers, and the lower you are down the hierarchy, the more you're probably going to be provided for by people higher up on the hierarchy.
No, but actually also in Kantir, that has been identified with Pyrameses, so the capital from which Ramesses II was ruling, have been excavated some spaces that have been interpreted as stables, royal stables. So it was something that also the state was taking care of. And something also important is that in Egypt, in the New Kingdom, the most important military men weren't only military men, but were mostly also important politicians, so they were men very nearby to the king. And so that's also why at the end of the 18th dynasty, we have some military men that actually take the throne. So we have Oremeb, we have Ai, and then we have Ramesses I. they are not at all from the royal family. They are military men, very important, very near to the king, that let's say managed to exploit the fact that there were no heirs, and so they managed to take the throne over. Yeah.
And how good were they at their generalship, and how good was the army?
How good?
Yes. And what we discussed here is that, for example,
Yes.
they were fighting the Hittites, but it seems to be that when the Hyksos arrive, they're completely overwhelmed.
With the Hyksos, it has been interpreted as an invasion, but it's actually not at all an invasion. It's misinterpretation based on the text of Manetho and Flavio Josephus. So it's a misinterpretation based on the ancient text, but actually it was no invasion. There were already Canaanite people living in the delta since the Middle Kingdom, so since almost the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, so since very long, and they just managed, they filtered into Egypt, and they just managed to exploit a period of difficulty at the end of the 13th dynasty to take the power in Lower Egypt. But it was most likely it wasn't a military invasion.
So what you're suggesting then, it's a process of immigration,
Yeah.
and the people then they rise to positions of prominence and power to the point there's a critical point at which they become the power itself.
Yeah, because these Canaanites that were, I call them Canaanite, but it's better to say Levantine people, they were in Lower Egypt. They become, in 2-3 generations, they became so integrated in the Egyptian society that they had adopted Egyptian names, and so they were making careers as officers, as bureaucrats. So they were also occupying very important positions. And this is, for example, attested by the same names. At the beginning, the first immigrants, you have not only Levantine names, but also they are designed as Amu, so as Asiatics. Something that you see then in later generations is not anymore. So they become very much integrated in Egyptian society. Though they retain some of their cultural marks, and they are visible in the, for example, in the pottery, some of the pottery that they use, in the tombs, in burial customs, and also in the same buildings, because also at Avaris there are 2 Canaanite temples, so-called Canaanite temples. So 2 temples that are of not an Egyptian but of Asiatic kind.
Okay. And do they make profound changes in any way in military terms?
Yeah, actually they are credited with introducing in Egypt the use of the chariot and the word chariot and the composite bow.
Oh.
Are they also used for the camp? The idea that they can encamp somewhere else, is that also an introduction from their technology?
No, it's not the fact of making a camp. The fact is that before starting using the chariots and the composite bow, the Egyptians weren't able of confronting the other Levantine kingdoms. They weren't on the same level from the point of military technology. So that's why with this introduction they are able to go and confronting them. Also because before the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military was based on the river and on the float. For example, also the same Kamose and Hamose, they use mostly the river to move upward. So they were mostly based on the river. And with the New Kingdom, so with the introduction of the chariot, they're able to fight more also on land.
So one thing that's always bothered me is that the Egyptian domestic literature
Yeah.
always emphasizes the massive problem
Yeah.
for any Egyptian citizen dying outside of Egypt. So one of the
Ah, yeah, Sinue. You refer to the story of Sinue.
there's other literature as well. The idea that you want to die
Yeah.
in Egypt. So the sort of how do they convince Egyptian citizens to travel and possibly die outside of Egypt has always been something that's intrigued me.
Yeah, but it has also most to do on how the Egyptian describe themselves, and then the foreigners. I mean, they have some topic for the foreigners, and that is also that they can take care well of their dead, so it is not a proper way. The death and the funerary cults were something very important for them to keep somebody alive in the afterworld. So there was nothing more terrible than be condemned to complete oblivion in the underworld. Yeah.
But presumably, Murray, when the Egyptian army is going overseas, as it were, overland, far outside its own borders, it is doing so in an act of conquest in the hope that that will itself become part of Egyptian territory. So they
part of Egypt, yeah. Which is probably getting back to the idea that if you go into a foreign expedition and aren't particularly successful, you're still going to proclaim it was, because where you got to was still Egypt.
That's a very, very neat solution.
Yeah, no, but of course that for the kings of Egypt, for them, so for everything belonged to them. So they weren't really border. Everything belonged to them.
But on the other hand, if the Hittites are on the other side of what they think is, that's a problem, isn't it?
And something else is also that the Egypt wasn't so isolated as it seems, neither during the Middle Kingdom, because we have cosmopolitan city as it was the same Avaris. We have Cypriot people living there. We have the Levantine people.
No.
So it wasn't so isolated. They were contacted also by sea. So they were going also by sea with Byblos. Byblos was a very important point of contact, a very important commercial partner, trade partner.
Well, I think this is one of the things that comes out in regular podcasts that we make, is the interconnectedness of the ancient world. I think we're now into a realm of understanding that ancient peoples knew about each other to a much greater extent and traded with each other, and therefore it's a much more complicated world that we are trying to study.
Just on that, I already mentioned the diplomatic interactions between Egypt and the other big kingdoms in the ancient Near East. The late Bronze Age has a very interesting dynamic going on there, in that it's a sort of balance of power there, where you have all these big kingdoms and they all maintain a balance, and a kind of a balance of terror almost, where they each know that if they are going to fight each other, it's going to be very prolonged, and that's probably also why the Battle of Kadesh ended the way that it did.
It's a Bronze Age version of assured mutual destruction.
Basically, yeah, basically. And the interesting thing is, of course, that we have these letter exchanges, and they all refer to each other as brothers. But the Egyptian kings always considered themselves better than their so-called peers. Because the Egyptian kings, among all the other kings, considered themselves gods on earth, whereas all the other Near Eastern kings had mandates from the gods, but they were not divine themselves. And this is what separated the Egyptian kings from the rest of their compatriots. And it's also one of the reasons, which is very interesting, we have these Near Eastern kings all trying to basically suck up to the Egyptian kings, and they send them their daughters and everything. No Egyptian king would ever think about sending one of his own daughters to marry, say, a Hittite king or an Assyrian prince or whatever, because you do not marry below your standing. Basically, a divinity does not marry below his or her standing, and that's also one of the reasons why in Egypt you have these brother-sister marriages and stuff like that. And that's always sort of the thing. You have all these great kings more or less equal, and then you have the Egyptians sort of above all of that.
That's coming back to what Ariana just said, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And
that the
it's very
Egyptians
interesting.
consider the whole world is part of the pharaoh considers that the world is part of his domain. It's just that some
Exactly.
people don't realize this yet.
Exactly. That's one of the funny things when you look at the letter exchanges. You have these Canaanite vassals and other Levantine subject peoples, and you have the other great king sending letters. And from what we can tell, the Egyptian pharaoh, the Egyptian kings did not always send letters back. So we have, for example, an account of somebody in the Levantine area that is ostensibly under Egyptian influence, control, saying, "Oh, my neighbors are being attacked one after the other. Please, oh king, send me an army. Send at least some archers." And the Egyptian king just doesn't seem to care at all, and they just disappear from history. So.
But do we know for sure that he did not respond? I mean, or is this there is no,
We have these letters that are sent repeatedly, and it keeps getting more dire. Where he says, please send something at least, send me at least a few archers," and then it just sort of stops the correspondence.
Well, it sounds to me more like a bureaucratic bungle that got passed on to somebody in another department and they lost the letter somehow.
Yeah, there are a few examples of letters that were probably misfiled, or letters that were never sent, letters that were translated from the original Egyptian into Akkadian and then filed and never sent, for example. So that sort of stuff also happens, and messengers that disappear because they were ambushed by the Apiru somewhere, or because we also have letter exchanges where you have, for example, the king of Ugarit or whatever sending a letter to Egypt saying, "My merchants were traveling through their land and they never came back. You have to make sure that your country is safe when my traders visit your lands." That sort of stuff happens a lot, so it's perfectly possible that this is
And
before
well,
email
it's
and pigeon post and whatever. So it's you have
Well, one of the
guys
great
on
things in a
horses.
bureaucracy, of course, is if you sit on it long enough, the problem does tend to solve itself and go away. So I'm sure the Egyptians were masters of that
Yeah,
too.
exactly. The guy nagging you for an army will eventually just stop because he's dead.
so on this note about keeping your internal and external countries safe, it's time to say thank you, Ariana, for your contribution. Thank you, Yoshio. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Murray. And we'll see you soon.